Welcome to School Leader Up Close. Today we are going to take a look at the spring 2024 issue of School Leader magazine, which features a terrific cover article on demystifying school rankings and ratings. This is a topic that frequently comes up, I think, within school boards and within the community. There are all different kinds of ratings and ranking systems out there, and they come out and it's hard to decipher them. So we are very pleased to have two experts in the area. We have Superintendent Dan Ross from the Dunellen Public Schools and Mark Schwarz from the Ridgewood Public Schools. So welcome to both of you, and I'm going to just dive right in. Dan, let's talk a little bit about, first of all, how interested are parents and community members and people in school rankings and ratings? What kind of an interest is there on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you for having us both. It's really a pleasure to be here. I would say that this is a really significant issue of public interest. There's, the depending on the community that you're in, school rankings and ratings can mean different things. There are some communities for whom it's, every aspect of every rating is very important. And there are some where school rankings and ratings come up primarily in the context of real estate. So I think, when we think about the project that we've undertaken here, we're looking at trying to provide kind of a blanket overview for anybody who's interested. And then there's obviously more information that people can dig into as they move forward. Schools are very complex places, and it's really hard to reduce the complexity of a school district to one number or one set of numbers. And so we think it's really important. I know that the members of the public, and certainly when Mark and I worked together in Madison, our public was very, very interested in this topic. And so that's really kind of what was the genesis for us doing this work.
Well, we're glad you did. Mark, what are the most common misconceptions that you hear about school ratings and rankings?
Well, I think the most common misconception is that they are an empirical measure of school quality. The reality is that they are the best measure that rankings and rating agencies can put together based on publicly available data. So these are not based on, I think speaking about all of the rating systems, they're all aggregated in mass and automatically. Some of the systems, such as niche.com, they use surveys that they integrate, but even those surveys are taken voluntarily by people online. So it's not as though there's one person assigned to every district and every school to ensure that these systems are accurate. They're pulling what is available from public data. And there's a good amount of public data, but that data is not necessarily reflective of all the important metrics that we can measure in a school. Additionally, what we know from educational research is that school, specifically test scores, which tend to drive a significant portion of these rankings, are also significantly impacted by the economic conditions and the socioeconomic conditions of the community of those schools. And so if you were to graph the affluence, the relative affluence of a community with their test scores, there'd be a very direct correlation between those two lines.
Yeah. I'm curious what both of you think. What are the things that are not captured when I read some of these ratings or rankings? What are other sources of information, and what are other considerations that would shed light on school quality?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start it. I came from 5 years of working with Mark in Madison to Dunellen Public Schools, and Dunellen is a lower socioeconomic school district by population. It's about 60% Hispanic, and by test score rankings and the types of academic outputs that are typically centered in these school rankings and rating systems, Dunellen is a very poor school district when you compare it to a place like Milburn or West Windsor, Plainsboro, or a more affluent district. At its heart, what is missing from school rankings and ratings is actually the feeling of the place, the diversity of a place, the vibe that you feel when you walk through the halls and you speak to people that work there. Some of this can be captured by surveys, but as Mark mentioned, survey participation is self-selected, and typically those who complete surveys are those with the most sort of divergent types of opinions about a district. So I would say, as a school district and as a superintendent in a school district of this sort, you really miss the heart and the soul of the school district when you kind of reduce it to metrics like the ones that are used in these types of systems.
Yeah, and I would piggyback off what Dan just said and agree with him wholeheartedly. So what we have done, to elaborate, he alluded to the fact that you can use surveys. And when we were in Madison working together, we did create a rather robust set of surveys aimed at trying to answer the questions that people had about the schools that they could not derive from the rankings and the ratings. So we started with questions around, well, what questions do people have about the school district? And then we designed survey items that might give us some sort of an insight as to how you would measure that heart and soul that he spoke about. And so that data set we would use in something we called the State of Schools address. So where we'd compare the different data points that are evaluated as part of school rankings, and we would put them alongside of data that we would pull together through these surveys. And that would start to create more of a complete picture around what the story of a school actually is.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Do you find that, one of the dangers in a lot of data and a lot of data analysis is that sometimes the available data is old and somewhat outdated. Do you find that's an issue with the school ranking systems that you looked at, or the sets of information?
Without a doubt. So one of the great examples of that is that one of the major drivers of some of these rankings, especially when they comment on things like school discipline, they're pulled from a submission that states that school districts have to do to the federal government called the CRDC, or the Civil Rights Data Collection. That's only collected once every 4 years or so. So in some cases, you'll be looking at suspension rates of a student, and it'll actually, or a student body, and that could be skewed by particular events that occurred in that year. Meanwhile, it's 4 years later, and that's still the reported data for that district. Now, in fairness to some of the companies, like greatschools.org is one of these, they have a little indicator, and it says, if there's a little eye with a circle, and if you click on the eye with a circle, it'll tell you where it's getting its data from. So, I think that's pretty honest, and I appreciate that. I know Dan and I have had to spend a lot of time trying to figure out where these data sources pull from, and we appreciate that level of transparency. And I'm up until recently, I haven't actually checked to see if it's been updated lately, but the 2018 CRDC was driving rankings, particularly with respect to discipline and proportionality of discipline for many years up until just a couple of years ago.
Yeah. And certainly in a high school, the entire student body has turned over within that time.
Exactly. Completely different group.
Yeah. How do you think these ratings are best used? If parents are curious about it or interested, and if especially if they're using them to try to choose where to live or what community to settle in, how do you think that what's the best use of these?
Yeah, I think it's important to note, both Mark and I come at this work as people who love data, and we talk a lot about, we've talked a lot in our, when we work together, before we work together, and certainly in our current positions, about the value of the data that's collected. I'm someone who, I think that students should take standardized testing. I think that, information should be shared and aggregated and reported out on. And I think that the transparency of that data is essential. I think that, Mark alluded to a really important thing with regard to the surveys that we did in Madison as part of the State of Schools address, which was, what are the questions that you want answered, right? And what types of answers are you looking for? So if a school district has a lot of diversity, and you're looking for a place with a lot of diversity, racial, ethnic, economic diversity, then there's good information within the ratings and ranking systems that demonstrate, whether a school district sort of meets the needs that you're after. If you're someone who's looking for, academic performance above all else, then you can look for the school district that has the highest test scores. It's important to recognize, and I think it's complicated for lay people to understand that the socioeconomic relationship between the relationship between socioeconomics and academic outputs is extremely strong, and has been demonstrated time and again to be highly correlated. And so when you think about, as a parent, going into a school district that has very high test scores, often parents will believe that that's the place where teaching is the best. And that is an assumption that's made. That's an incorrect assumption. But it's the types of questions that you're looking for And I think when parents come to public school and they think about an experience that they want their kids to have, I think really thinking about what you want as a parent, I think is essential. Do you want a small school district? Do you want a large school district where things will be much more competitive, but you have access to many more types of programs and clubs? Do you want a diverse district, or do you want a district that's more affluent and typically, has a much higher percentage of white and Asian students? The questions that you are asking, I think, are the questions that you should be looking for in terms of the ratings and rankings, taking away kind of a holistic ranking of a 10 out of 10 or something like that, and really just looking at the specific indicators that you believe to be important.
Yeah, and I would say just echo all that statement as well, that it really comes down to what's important to you. I mean, Dan and I have been looking at these rating systems for so long. I'm very comfortable looking at them, and I do look at them to help compare districts, to understand the stories of the districts. I think the key is just to know the limitations of what that data are. And I think when you talk about particularly test scores, which is a significant component, but not the only component that's factored into these systems, one of the things you want to look at is recognize is that when you see very strong test scores for many, many years, you're going to want to pay attention to you're going to learn that community is one that is at minimum very, very academically focused, and most likely more affluent than other communities as well. Now, if you're looking at comparable communities that have similar demographics and similar structures, and you see that over time, generally speaking, there are higher performance levels at that one school, that may very well reflect that there is a higher academic culture at that school. But again, there's a lot of subjectivity there, and trying to learning more about the school district. You can learn a lot by going to the school district's website. You can learn a lot by talking to people from those communities as well. So I would definitely recommend that they're a part of the decisions that people make when they are choosing a community that they want to live in, or when they're trying to evaluate how things are going in their schools.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in, a real quick addition to that is Mark and I, when we did the State of the Schools addresses, we developed a data plot that looked at the percentage of economically disadvantaged students and academic outputs. And what we were able to demonstrate through that was that there are some places that have incredibly good, an incredibly positive culture of academic success. The State of the Schools addresses that we did in Madison are all available on the Madison Public Schools website. We use them, and we've used that type of analysis in our own work in a number of different ways. But elucidating that information about the difference between communities, and then looking at what conclusions can actually be drawn, I think is really essential. I would urge all superintendents to do that work in their own district, just to help round out the information that's available publicly.
Agreed. Shannon, I'm having trouble hearing you.
I'm sorry, I was muted for a minute. One last question. As administrators, how do you use these rankings and ratings to change things in your district? Do you use it in guiding you at all in some of your decisions about the district?
You want to start with that, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, in the community that I'm in currently, there's much less concern about many aspects of the rankings and rating systems. What I tend to look at more is raw data from the school performance report, comparative data that's published by the Department of Education, and district factor groups. When I think about the work that we do, I'd rather look at the things that I think are important as a superintendent for my community and try to address those within the context of that data. The rankings and rating systems serve some value, right, for those folks who find them to be valuable. But I feel like as a superintendent, I don't need that level of framing in order to inform my own decisions. I would rather go to the raw data, pick out the things that I believe would be good drivers of success in the future, and then work on those with my team. So decreasing chronic absenteeism, right? Increasing growth in our academic outputs. Those types of things I know to be important, and I can go directly to the DOE or the release data to be able to do that on behalf of my team and my community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would say I think that I think I've been a little pessimistic here about rankings and ratings most of this conversation, but I will say I think one of the good things about rankings and rating systems, as long as you can understand how to interpret them correctly, is that they do democratize the data. They make it widely publicly available in a format that people can actually process. So as long as you know what you're looking at and you understand the limitations, it's wildly useful. I mean, otherwise you'd be pulling spreadsheets to be able to compare school districts. I regularly use School Digger as a professionally, because it does one thing. It does several things, but it does one thing really well, and that is it does percentile ranks based on tests, particularly on NJSLA, and it shows percentile rank over time, and it'll just graph the chart over time. So you can get a kind of a sense of like the trend of academic performances across the district. And you can also see trend lines with respect to changes in demographics, particularly with increases in in students enrolled in free and reduced lunch program, which we know could represent changes in the student body, which was a population that is going through challenges who shouldn't be held to the same expectation that they're going to pass the test. So those are some ways to just get some basic insights as to how things are going. I even use them in real time with the current school district. But to Dan's point, I mean, those are just rough points of reference. These are really, when it comes down to actually telling the story of how your district is doing, it's important that you choose the metrics that matter to you. I always say, I've said it in my last district, I say it here in Ridgewood all the time, that we measure what matters to us, right? Like when we have a child, we weigh everything and measure everything about that child. You go to the doctor, they want you to get blood panels, right? So the measurements matter, but just like when you get your blood panel, like some of that data just doesn't necessarily mean very much to you, but it means something to your doctor maybe. But the bottom line is that there are certain markers that are really the most important. And so for me, it's about organizing my community to help them identify with me what are the metrics that they really care about. And then I help them with my experience and my expertise to really refine those metrics and those representations. Like Dan mentioned that scatter plot, that was a distribution of percentage of enrollments and then also proficiency rates. And it was a powerful tool for comparison and it was a really creative visualization that he came up with one of our riff sessions. And it really became a powerful central tool of what we used. And so I think when you can figure out those things that matter and you can create a visualization that works with that, then you can create a tool that is actually really helpful for the community. So I think that, again, I don't think there's a reason to overly stigmatize them, except for the fact that we need to recognize, and I didn't say this yet, but if people don't understand how these systems work and they treat these ranking systems as the be all end all of school quality, and when they look at a school that gets a 3 out of 10 versus a 10 out of 10, and they just assume that the teachers are that much better, or the administrators are that much better, or that's a reflection of like the quality of instruction in any classroom, they are completely missing the point. And the reality is that the harsh reality is that people buy houses based on these scores. And there are wonderful, and I believe that this significantly contributes to the segregation, the demographic segregation in New Jersey. And I think if more people understood it better, I think people would be less emphatic about having to be in that one specific zip code.
Well, this has been real food for thought. I appreciate you both spending the time with us. I would urge viewers to go to the NJSBA website and see the spring issue for more details on this topic. And I thank both Dan and Mark very much.
Such a pleasure to meet you, Janet.
Take care.